Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to Stereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. Today we're going to stay on the Indiana Jones theme and talk about a cult arcade game as well as some shameful adaptations, including the one for the Atari ST. This game is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom by Atari, originally published in 1985 in its arcade version, then in 1986, 88, and 89 for its multiple conversions. Before we begin, thanks to my patrons via Patreon, as well as those who subscribe to my channel and those who join my Facebook group. The information appears on the screen. Now, let's talk about the game.
Or rather the movie, to begin with. Regarding the Indiana Jones franchise, considering the first trilogy, this was my least favorite. The game in its original version roughly exhibits four parts of the film, namely, the mine with the rescue of child slaves, the wagon pursuit, the recovery of a Shankara stone, and the escape via the suspension bridge. The Temple of Doom is, shall we say, an always scrolling platformer game. In fact, it's a hybrid, as there are also elements of continuous mazes, at least for the mine part. It ran on the Atari System 1 motherboard, which was also used for Marble Madness, to name a few. The game was also enriched with a rendition of the film's original soundtrack, as well as digitized sound effects, some of which, if not all, were taken from the film. In short, it was the perfect recipe for great success for 1985.
And how many quarters I spent to play the game in its original version. I was also expecting a lot from the ST adaptation of the game, and how disappointed I was.
After all, the original game was developed by Atari. How could we massacre such a cult game on a computer bearing the same logo? I understood that the adaptation did not come from Atari, but rather from Paragon Programming. Paragon, notably responsible for the game 10th Frame, which I will talk about in an upcoming episode. A decent game aimed toward a more adult audience, let's say.
I warn you immediately, I will not be affectionate regarding Temple of Doom in its ST version.
Nothing, or almost nothing, is worth mentioning. It's certainly a scrolling game, but somewhat sloppy in my opinion, first considering the scrolling precisely. As I often say, the Atari ST's screen memory is divided into 32-bit clusters for 8 pixels. To quickly scroll horizontally, we need to copy and paste in 32-bit chunks, although we usually work within 64-bit slices for 16 pixels, reason why black borders at the edges of the screen are 16 pixels wide. The problem is that it's jerky and slow, and that goes for vertical scrolling for some odd reason. Sometimes the protagonist has to almost reach one end of the playing area for the program to scroll, but it's hard to keep up, scrolling efficiently I mean, as Indy keeps moving.
One reason for this is that the original Atari ST had no blitter chip, thus all image manipulation had to be done within the program. Continuous scrolling can overload the CPU.
And yet, in games like Gods or Magic Pockets, we do have scrolling in all directions over almost the entire play screen, in 16-bit bursts without black borders at the edges, and without much slowdown when there are many sprites of all sizes on the screen.
It's fluid for the ST and exemplary of good gameplay even if you're confined to a single button controller.
The jerky scrolling is one of the aspects that hampers gameplay, and that goes for the mine wagon chase. Unlike the segment when we have to rescue the slave children, the diagonal scrolling is done continuously, at least 2 pixels at a time, but for this we sacrifice the shades of colors and we perform a constant refresh of the playing area, which adds to the jerky effect. For the segment depicting the temple where sacrifices occur, the choice of colors is questionable. The glowing lava effect results from a rotation of color assignment in the palette, which is true for torch flames. This is a gimmick that allows to simulate a form of animation without monopolizing the processor.
The problem is that there is too much of it. Looks like an Olympic swimming pool filled with orange jello.
Another inconvenience lies in the hit detection. Sometimes you whip the air and kill a snake, or a pterodactyl, or a giant vampire bat. Sometimes you whip enemies and it's like whipping the air. Which brings me to the animation. In the arcade version, the whip animation is swift, allowing you to quickly hit multiple antagonists. In the ST version, it's awfully slow to the point that you often have to plan the assault or strike well in advance. And forget the diagonals. If one can move in 8 directions, as in the arcade version, one can only whip according to the 4 cardinal directions.
From a visual standpoint, it's sad. First off, we strangely exploit the 16-color palette of the Atari ST. Moreover, the game screen is only a fraction of the total screen.
In the arcade version, we had a resolution of 336 by 240 pixels, with 256 possible colors out of a total of 1024. It's more than that of the Atari ST in its original version. However, not all 256 colors are used at the same time in the arcade version, which means that with some programming tricks, we could have had a visual akin to what we can observe on the ST screen.
Regarding sprites and animation, it's equally shameful.
The characters look like cartoon characters with black outlines and feature very few animation frames. We could certainly, in theory, have had sprites similar to those of the arcade version with ingeniously chosen colors and more frames. But was it possible?
The 520 ST had a fraction of its 512 kilobytes of memory available for any given program.
If Indy measures 768 to 1024 pixels facing right, that's up to 512 bytes of memory. If we count 3 frames of animation in this direction, we are at 1536 bytes of data. Then we have Indy facing left, Indy facing up, Indy facing down, when he whips, when he performs a Tarzan swing, when he falls, when he dies, thus about 12 kilobytes for the protagonist animation alone. Then we have the antagonist guards, which also feature 3 frames of animation for every direction they can face and go, not to mention knockdown visuals, as well as when they fall. Not to mention the enemies riding wagons, nor the giant pterodactyl bats, and Molaram, who appears from time to time to send you a flaming heart or a ball of fire. Then there are the sprites attached to the settings: skulls, skeletons, gasoline tanks, cages of child slaves. And finally, there's the scenery, made up mostly of 16 by 16 pixel tiles: the walls, the platforms, the ladders, the rails, the temple, and the lava, shall we say.
All this adds up, and you can quickly run out of memory if you're designing a game to run on a 520 ST.
Thus, I understand that it would have been necessary to cut corners somewhere. This goes for the digitized sound effects, absent from the game in its ST version. However, we do have some on the Amiga, so I have a hard time understanding this editorial choice. And regarding the music, a very small part of the soundtrack is played through the tone channels, not even all 3 of them. And for the few sound effects there are, it's as if we had reserved a channel specifically for this purpose. Nothing comparable to the arcade version.
But could we have done better in these perspectives, meaning sound-wise?
A decent quality 1-second digitized sound effect requires 8 kilobytes of memory. With 10 sound effects, we are at 80 kilobytes, which is about a quarter of the usable memory of a 520 ST.
Again, without apologizing for or to the developers of the ST adaptation of the game, some things had to be sacrificed.
The game is no less difficult as it is. As much as the arcade version is flawless, the ST adaptation is sometimes frustrating. I don't mind that the difficulty increases as the game progresses. This is one of the fundamental principles of good game design, but having a game that is practically unplayable for reasons of hardware constraints, in my opinion, it was not worth adapting as it was. Hence, I don't feel very guilty for occasionally taking advantage of the game's flaws when they are to my advantage. For example, the infamous hit detection, as well as the ability to outrun pterodactyl bats or flaming hearts that eventually disappear.
Of course, I have to talk about competing adaptations.
On the Amiga, it's almost a copy-paste of the ST version, except for the sound effects. Indie's colors are somewhat different, which goes for some sprites, but as far as scrolling goes, it's like we've refrained from using the blitter. On PCs running DOS, it looks a lot like the ST and Amiga versions. It runs in EGA mode with its 16 dubious colors. We have digitized sound effects, let's say, going through the beeper. Above all, the scrolling is more fluid than that of the ST and Amiga versions, or, to say the least, better led. Speaking of scrolling, I have to mention the adaptation for the Commodore 64. For a machine running at 1 MHz, it's flawless. Admittedly, we only have 16 fixed colors, the choice of which sometimes leaves something to be desired. The horizontal resolution is half to illustrate 4 per cell, but it's very playable. Speaking of machines running at 1 MHz, here's the Apple IIe version, running in double high-res mode to illustrate 16 colors instead of 6. The Apple II didn't have a dedicated scrolling chip like a blitter, so all copy and paste instructions had to be done within the program, in its code, and it shows. Nice effort though. The importance of having a dedicated graphics and/or scrolling chip can make all the difference. For example, the original NES ran at 1.79 MHz in its NTSC version, but its PPU was clocked at 5.37 MHz for each of the 4 signals, for a total of 21.48 MHz. Still, it hardly feels like the arcade version, and I didn't find it fun to play.
I spare you the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC versions, but in both cases we find the same hit detection and scrolling issues.
As usual, I ask the question, could we have done better for Temple of Doom? When it comes to scrolling, yes, of course. From a visual standpoint, certainly. Sound-wise, perhaps.
And what about replayability?
As with many arcade games, the replay value should, in principle, be quite high. The problem is the playability of the ST adaptation. The arcade version of Temple of Doom is very fast and smooth. The response time is almost immediate. The hit detection is very precise. It also appeals to reflexes, while the ST version appeals more to patience. It doesn't do the original version justice, unlike other arcade game adaptations on ST. I also don't consider it being a killer app, a game that encourages the purchase of the computer. There are, of course, 3 difficulty levels, which also applies to the arcade version, but in the latter, the easy mode is relatively easy, while the easy level on the ST version is pretty hard.
Having done better, finally?
Definitely, I would have presented the game on almost the entire screen rather than on a fraction. I would also have invested in the response time 2 or 4 each action. I definitely would have opted for a digital sound environment on occasion, even if it meant alternating music and sound effects like in International Karate Plus. Above all, I would have spent more time fine-tuning the scrolling and trying to maintain the protagonist's sprite somewhere in the middle of the playfield or area, rather than scrolling the scenery when he's near its edges.
This was today's episode. As usual, like, subscribe, share, support, and don't hesitate to let me know in the comments of your impressions regarding Temple of Doom, the game, especially its ST adaptation. Moreover, if there are any games you'd like me to talk about, let me know. I'm Guy from The Other Day. See you soon.